Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all to our second round table in this very special event. Our second round table is titled Israeli Policy Towards Populist and also Anti-Semitic Political Parties in Europe. Before I present to you my distinguished speakers for the next hour and a half, I would like to start with a short story. On the 10th of July 2018, as part of a routine guided tour in the memorial site of former concentration camp Sachsenhausen in the outskirts of Berlin, a group of 17 German visitors were paving their way between the few remaining barracks. Suddenly, in the middle of the tour, 5 to 6 persons among the visitors began interrupting the lecture given by the guide and were reported to have constantly manifested extreme, far-right, historically revisionist and anti-Semitic remarks. The remarks were so severe and alarming that the expert guide on that day had no other choice but to break off his presentation. This group of visitors that came on the July 10th, 2010 to visit Sachsenhausen belonged to the constituency of the opposition party Alternative for Germany, the AfD, co-led today by Alice Weidel and Alexander Gauland in the German Bundestag. Weidel was traveling on that week under a federal-funded trip to enable voters of the AfD to visit parliamentarians in Berlin. Even though physically she did not attend the visit in Sachsenhausen, this has to be said. But in an interview given just a year before this incident by Weidel's predecessor, Frauke Petri, to the newsletter Die Welt, she was quoted having said that the party is one of the few political guarantors of Jewish life, also in times of illegal anti-Semitic migration to Germany, end of quote. AfD politicians state nowadays that they care deeply about the security of Jews in Germany, care for Israel's security, support Israel's government, demand that Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state, reject unilaterally recognizing Palestine as a state, and generally support a stronger relationship between Jerusalem and Berlin. The Alternative for Germany is only one example of an ever-growing, alarming phenomenon. Extreme right-wing populist parties, not only right-wing, also radical left, some with clear anti-Semitic sentiments, clear roots, are constantly trying to pave their way into Israeli consensus and society by expressing their unconditional support both to Jews in Europe and to the State of Israel, and trying to clean themselves from their, in some part, also anti-Semitic past. To what extent is it really the case in these parties? How much are they really friends of Israel, quote unquote, as they claim, or friends of the Jews in Europe today? From Austria's Freedom Party to Hungary's Fidesz, via Italy's Lega Party, France's En Marche, and many others, populist, extreme, Eurosceptic, xenophobic, and also with anti-Semitic roots, historical roots. They're looking for ways to connect, to better connect with the State of Israel and the Jews in Europe today. So what should be Israel's official reaction, official response to this phenomenon? Should there be any relations between extreme right-wing populist parties in Europe and Israel today? What about populism and anti-Semitism coming from the left? We will discuss all these questions in the distinguished roundtable that we're going to have in the next hour and a half, or a little bit less than that. I would like to introduce to you the distinguished speakers for today. I will start with Her Excellency Dr. Susanne Wasum-Rainer. She serves today as ambassador of German Republic, Federal Republic in Israel, and she worked in the headquarters of the German Foreign Office in Bonn, later in the German Embassy in Morocco, and now, as I said, in Israel. She was a staff member of the permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva, and was first officer to the Foreign Office and head of the unit supervisor. Ambassador Wasum-Rainer was ambassador to France, Italy, and now Israel. I'm proceeding to Professor Yehuda Bauer. Professor Bauer, historian, scholar, and a scholar of the Holocaust. He's Professor Emeritus of History and Holocaust Studies at the Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and academic advisor to Yad Vashem. Professor Bauer has written numerous books and articles on the Holocaust and on genocide. In 1998, he was awarded the Israel Prize, the highest civilian award in Israel, and has served as advisor to the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research. Moving on to Dr. Rodica Radian-Gordon, at the end. She's an Israeli diplomat, was second secretary at the Israeli embassy in Warsaw, and first secretary at the Israeli representation at the European Community in Brussels. After holding several posts in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, she became Israeli ambassador to Romania and Mexico. In 2015, she was appointed Deputy Director General for Western Europe in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And last but not least, Ms. Noa Landau is a diplomatic reporter for Haaretz. She served as head of the news department and editor of Haaretz English edition. Before Haaretz, Ms. Landau worked as the news reporter and editor for Galatz, for Galei Tzahal, Channel 10, and Ma'ariv newspaper. She was a 2016 fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, where she studied the rise of gag orders in Israel. Welcome, distinguished speakers, and thank you very much for participating in this very important roundtable. I will be happy to start with, as you know, a 10-minute maximum, because we have a lot of things to discuss and very little time. 10-minute statement of each and every one of you. How do you assess the situation today between Israel and populist political parties in Europe? What lies ahead? What are the challenges? What are the dangers, if you see? Each one, if you may, from your own personal perspective, the historical perspective, the diplomat, the journalist, and so on. I would start with Professor Bauer, please.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. I think I'm living proof of the fact that not all dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. And the advantage of old age is that I couldn't care less about what people think of me and what they think of what I say. Also, these last few decades have shown to me, I think, very clearly that skepticism and, to a certain extent, cynicism is appropriate when you approach international affairs. Having said that, the problem that we are supposed to address is really part of a much more general issue. There are, as far as I'm concerned, three types, central types of anti-Semitism. One of them is what we all know to be the anti-Semitism of second, third generation Muslim immigrants to Europe, not only to Europe, who are a very small proportion of the Muslim immigration, but a very dangerous one. Second, the old type, if one can say so, of right-wing and really neo-Nazi, though I'm not quite sure that neo is the appropriate term here, attitudes that spread in the original, let's say, native populations of Europe and America, not only North America, Central and South America as well. And the third type is the so-called liberal or left-wing anti-Semitism, which is the expression of a loss of way, a loss of path, of a large number of liberal left-wing people who cover the anti-Semitism with humanistic liberal slogans. And what we see in Eastern Europe today is something else. It's nationalism, violent nationalism, which has as its corollary elements of anti-Semitism that are in the society, in Poland, in Hungary, and in some other places. It's not only there. Violent nationalism, identity nationalism spreads all over the place, including Israel. And the issue in some of these countries is not the Jews. Now, you see, in these places, they don't deny the Holocaust. Quite the contrary. The Holocaust happened. The Germans did it, not we. No. We love Jews, especially dead ones. And we create museums for them, and we make exhibitions, and we sanctify places where they were killed, and so on, and we make speeches, wonderful, terrific speeches. You know, words don't cost money, and the speeches are just terrific. That is one aspect of it. For me, the problem then arises that the Israeli government, and not only the Israeli government, Israeli political scene identifies with that. There are, of course, people who look at the Holocaust and anti-Semitism seriously. But among the politicians, that is a little bit rare. So our politicians, too, make terrific speeches. They understand about the Holocaust more or less what I understand about African zebras, that they are small horses in pajamas. That's more or less what they understand about the Holocaust, but they speak about it wonderfully. That is the problem, you see. Now, how do you break that? That's the $64,000 question. Now, there's more to it than that. See, because there's a background to it, several backgrounds. Without realizing or dealing with those backgrounds, we won't advance the reform. We deal here with Europe, with the European Union. Maybe we should start an association at this university of fighting against the disintegration of the European Union. Because the European Union is not in a healthy state. It's Brexit and all kinds of exits, and Eurosceptics all over the place, and a threat to the existence of the European Union. We here, I think, personal opinion, should be interested in the existence of the European Union, not only because it's our major trade partner, but because there's a hope that maybe Israeli politics can learn something from Europe, and Europe can learn something from us. And it's a question of education. And the other basic issue is that we deal with Europe and we don't deal with the world. There's no anti-Semitism in China. There's no anti-Semitism in India. There's practically no anti-Semitism in Indonesia. In polytheistic societies, anti-Semitism doesn't exist, because in polytheistic societies, if you have another God, that's perfectly fine. So there's another one. Monotheistic societies, so-called monotheistic societies, are different. Because here, in monotheistic societies, if you don't believe what I believe, you will roast in hell for all eternity. And when that is sort of watered down, and well, we don't really mean that, you know, we are sort of different. The tradition is there. Why do I say so-called monotheism? Because in Judaism you have a Satan, an anti-God. It's in the Bible. In Christianity you don't just have a Satan, you have a Trinity. And you have lots and lots of saints in Catholicism. I spent a year in a Catholic monastery, so I should know. And in the Protestant churches, the Satan, and all over the place there are lots and lots of angels floating about. And in Islam you have Satan, and of course those great angels, you know. Monotheism, there ain't no such thing. But the legend about monotheism is there. And it's terribly dangerous. The legend, not the monotheism, the legend. And anti-Semitism spreads in North, Central, South America. And the desire for knowledge about Jewish culture and civilization exists and is spreading in the polytheistic societies. There are today 5 universities in China that teach the Holocaust. There are Indian academics that want to know how to teach the Holocaust in Indian schools. There's a wonderful Senegalese academic who writes about a comparison between the genocide in Rwanda and the murder of the Jews in Poland. Spreading, the positive parts are spreading as well. Now, I subscribe to everything my friend and colleague, Professor Dina Porat, what Dina said is absolutely correct. So I won't repeat that, because she's right. What can I do? I just developed this. And the background to this has to be seen in a global sense, in a global way. You can't deal just with the European Union and not with the nationalistic governments and societies in parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. Now, the problem in Eastern Europe are not the Jews. How many Jews are there in Poland? 15,000. How many Jews are there in Lithuania? 5,000. In Hungary there are maybe 120,000. In all of Europe, the Jews constitute 1/5 of 1% of the total population. They're totally unimportant. So why do we deal with that? That's the big question. Why the Jews and not all men with green eyes and all women with red hair? Why the Jews? Not genealogy. We are about as pure a race as any Tel Aviv street poodle. And if there were green and blue people in the world, there would be green and blue Jews. DNA probes have shown that 40% of the DNA of European and North African Jews are Middle East, but 60% of our DNA is not Middle East. We are just as mixed as everyone else. But the civilization is there, a tremendous civilization which created, or shall we say, gave the starting point to Christianity and Islam in its negative and positive ways. Small group. How many are we? 12 million all over the world? A tiny percentage, totally unimportant percentage. And everybody's talking about Jews. Because of the civilization. This is what we should emphasize in our answer to anti-Semitism. The Israeli government is doing that. It's not. Not this one and not the ones that preceded it. We need an approach that will not be apologetic, that will look at the world on equal terms, will not hide the negative parts of our existence. If criticism, even sharp criticism of the policies of Israel were anti-Semitism, then 30%, including myself, would have to be qualified as anti-Semites. No, that's not the issue. The issue is the right of this tiny people to have its own, along with others. Not more, not less. We are not there, not by a very, very long way. And we here have to address not only Polish government and Hungarian government and Lithuanian and Ukrainian government. Quite a problem. But our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these words, Professor Bauer. I would like to give you the stage, dear ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this important conference. Of course, I would have never chosen to speak after Yehuda Bauer. Yehuda Bauer is a personality whom I know ever since, who explained me ever since the history of my country and whose writings I have known from early days of university studies, and to whom I'm forever grateful for all the scientific work he has done. Of course, my government considers the resurgence of anti-Semitism as a real danger to our open, pluralistic, democratic societies in Europe and beyond. And my government is also concerned about the populist, nationalist, anti-parliamentary movements in Germany and beyond. And you mentioned already the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. I don't think that I have to underline here, but I would like to say nevertheless that we are very proud and very happy about the possibility of a Jewish community that re-established in Germany after the Shoah. And I mean, all of us are very kind of happy, or we understand the miracle also of that, of having in Berlin such a big Jewish community, and we are very happy about especially the young Israelis who come to enrich Germany again with German culture, Jewish culture. It's a totally different situation than it was, of course, until the Shoah. But nevertheless, it is extremely important for Germany to have this Jewish life having returned over 6 million dead into our cultural and political, into our society. So also in Germany, anti-Semitism increased. I got a statistic that spoke about, and I don't know how this number is, how it was found, of 1,646 criminal acts with anti-Semitic background. And of course, this is exactly 1,646 acts too many. It is a deep shame, I think, also for Germany that young men can be beaten in German streets when they wear a kippah. And of course, I also think it's terrible that children will not feel safe in Jewish schools in Germany without the protection of police. So the federal government takes that, and I really assure that very, very seriously. It is our, it is a responsibility. It's a priority, and it's a unique responsibility, especially particular in the light of the Shoah. There's many measures that have been taken. And I also suffer under the discrepancy that Dina mentioned about the measures and the words, and nevertheless, that we couldn't stop this rise in anti-Semitism. We have introduced, this is one of the many measures, I think it was a good one, a nationwide mechanism also for registration of any kind of anti-Semitic acts. What we need is, and everybody is aware of that, we need to increase education and awareness. We need to increase awareness also for the hidden expressions of anti-Semitism. We had many incidents that were not really, I mean, to violate a Jewish person, but it was so hidden expressions of anti-Semitism, so subdued forms. This is also that, I mean, something we really have to concentrate on. So I just want to say education. The defense of a pluralistic and democratic society goes hand in hand in the fight against anti-Semitism. The resurgence of populist nationalism brings back all the prejudices against others, jealousy, hatred, and fear that we have seen before. And we think that a line is crossed when xenophobia and anti-Semitism are used for short-sighted political benefits. Xenophobia and anti-Semitism goes hand in hand, and we have to act against both at the same time, immediately. It is not without reason that the alliance of conservative parties in the EU, the European People's Party, discusses the option to exclude Fidesz right now in these days from its platform. Speaking about Europe, for us Germans, the European Union is not just one political option among many. It has an existential, crucial value for Germany. We consider the EU as the most successful project for peace and prosperity in, let's say, in history, in modern history. It has made our societies overcome the disasters of the Second World War, overcome the Iron Curtain, but it is particularly, it is created, as Emanuele said before, as a response to the dramatic experiences of World War II and the Shoah. The unprecedented breach of civilization during the Shoah. And this is what I want to underline really, the European Union for us, but also objectively, has never ever just been an economic union. It was always a union based on values. And I say that because we have, as this was also already mentioned, the upcoming elections for the European Parliament, and we have all those populist parties turning against Europe without taking into account this historic basis, this base of the European Union. So when speaking again about Germany, I wanted to assure you that all the polls and statistics confirm that although there is the AfD that rose for reasons we are not going to discuss here, related also to the migration challenge that we faced, the overwhelming majority of Germans think that Germany within the European Union is more safe for the German citizens than outside of the European Union. We think that an overwhelming majority of Germans see their future within a democratic and pluralistic European Union. With a view to the importance of the European Union for us as for all the other member states of the Union, with the view to the importance of values and the challenges the European Union faces, we would appreciate our closest partners, also from outside the European Union, helping to strengthen the European Union and helping to strengthen its founding values. This is what was underlined also by my foreign ministers in a speech on Monday. He added that Germany will place the fight against all forms of anti-Semitism and all forms of these anti-value campaigns of populist parties as a priority in Germany's EU presidency that will take place next year in the framework of this 6-month rotation. Having said all that, and coming to your question, what was it? The question on Israeli, how it is framed, policy towards populist and anti-Semitic parties. I would like to have 3 sentences maybe as a conclusion. Israel is one of our closest partners in Europe. Israel is a very strong pluralistic democracy, and we want to see Israel on our side and defending all those shared values of an open societies in Europe and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the Ambassador. Dr. Radian-Gordon, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Adi. First of all, I have to say that I really am very much honored to be here and glad to hear this panel and the previous one. And while I was listening to all the speakers, I realized I had to change what I was planning to say. I think that my answer to your question will be relatively short, in terms that I think that all along the years, when it comes to populist parties that have an ideology that is has its roots either in the far anti-Semitic right or in the leftist anti-Semitic side of the floor. I don't think there is any dilemma there, and recently we saw the government in Austria. One of the components of the coalition in Austria, of course, being the Freedom Party, with whom we do not have contacts. We do not contact the ministers of this party, but we do have of course, relations and very strong ones with the Austrian Chancellor and the Parliament and so on. So I don't think we ignore those elements that are very problematic. I would like, though, to say more than a few words about our relations with Poland, for example, and with other Eastern European countries. And I would like also to base what I'm going to say on my proper experience, since I started my diplomatic career in Poland the beginning of the 1990s. So shortly after the re-establishment of relations with Poland. That was 93 to 96. And in Romania, I served between 2003 and 2007. So these were the exact years when Romania coped with its recent past, both when it comes to the Holocaust and also to the communist period. And when I first came to Poland, I think the issue number one, and perhaps it was it took 75 to 90% of our time at the embassy, was dealing with the past, and more accurately with recent past. We commemorated the 50 years of the liberation of Auschwitz and of other extermination camps, and there were mass graves, and there were perished communities in Poland. So the history was a very, very big part and important part of the bilateral relations. And of course, there was the issue of the rights amongst the nations. And taking into account that we hadn't had diplomatic relations for many years between 67 and 90 and 89, and the fact that many of the survivors only started telling their stories at a later stage in life. So we had about 150 recognized writers amongst the nations each year. And some of them were not alive anymore, some of them were alive and lived in remote parts of Poland. So we spent quite a lot of time going to these places, thanking these people, having very, very emotional ceremonies. And it became part of the relations. And then started the trips to Poland, the youth trips to Poland. And we made it a point from the beginning of the 1990s of having contacts between young people, young Israelis and young Polish people, in order for both sides to see present societies, to make contacts and to have a discussion. And of course it's not easy, and of course there was a lot of resentment at the beginning and so on. 30 years have passed, and I think in those 30 years we have succeeded in building a dialogue, in doing some very, very important work in the bilateral relations. And of course we live in the real world, and we know that Poland and Hungary and all of the former Eastern Bloc is part of the European Union. And an important part, and I would say, if I'm allowed to imagine what these countries would say, then I think that also for them it's very important to be part of the European Union, and they fought very hard in order to become part of the European Union, and they had to change a lot in their mentality in order to become part of the European Union. But of course it's a long process. I would like to say a few words about Romania. I came to Romania a few months after the then president declared that there was no Holocaust in Romania. I'm of Romanian origin. I grew up in Romania a few years, and my family comes from there. Immediately after that, the Romanian president, Mr. Iliescu, realized that it was a faux pas. And he declared a commission on researching the Holocaust in Romania, in which we had very distinguished historians from Israel, from Romania, from other places, and they did, I think, a very thorough work. Now, it's true about Romania, it's certainly true about the Ukraine, I think, about Poland, about Hungary. These are countries that lived a short period of independence between the First and Second World War. And that period was also was both very nationalistic and anti-Semitic at the same time. But they had national heroes. And these national heroes were, at least in the case of Romania, but I'm sure this is not the only case, they were also prominent intellectuals who had a name not just in Romania, but all over, and they were anti-Semites. And what does Romania do now when it is part of Europe, not part of the communist bloc anymore, and it has to have its own national heroes? Where will it look for national heroes, if not in the prominent intellectuals that they had in the 1930s? Now, how do you cope with that? How do you tell Romanians, look, your national heroes were actually anti-Semites, and these days they would not have been accepted to any civilized society? What do you do then? So it is a very delicate role that not just Israeli diplomats have, but I think that I must say that I had a very good cooperation from many European ambassadors, from the American ambassador at the time, and so on, from many countries. And at the end of this process, by the way, Ambassador Constantinescu at the time was the advisor to the Prime Minister. And he was one of my best interlocutors. And he was one of the first people that understood what Romania had to do. And Romania decided to become part of the ITF, then IRA. And they took upon themselves the issue of education. Now, education is a long process, and you first have to start with educating the educators. And it's not easy. I saw that in Romania, I saw that in Poland. We had groups of history teachers and other teachers from remote places where anti-Semitism is alive and kicking until today. And they had to face resentment from their own communities because the parents didn't want the teachers to be teaching about the Holocaust in the schools. And we had to convince them, nevertheless, to do the effort. So I think it's a very, it's a long-term process. And I think the onus is obviously on Europe, on these countries to continue the effort and not to give up. Of course, we nudge. We, as Israel, nudge. And we have to be very sensitive and so on. And I'm not saying that we are always perfect, and perhaps the government is not always 100% right in its approaches, but I think that given the realities and given the circumstances, we definitely have a component of morality in Israeli foreign policy, and it's not going away. And we need to realize that it's not enough, to have declarations and so on. All of that is very important because it gives the legal background or the moral background or the needed forces for governments to act. But we need to understand that it's also a bottom-up process that is long-term and has to be fostered by everybody, and first and foremost by the proper governments of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Noa Landau.
Thank you for inviting me. So I'm not an expert, as my distinguished fellow speakers here. I'm just a journalist who asks questions. I cover Israel's foreign relations, and I follow our Prime Minister Netanyahu around the world. So I speak to the experts when I have questions, and when we talk about anti-Semitism in Europe, I speak also, for example, with the local Jewish communities. They know best because they live it, right? Of course, we know that everywhere Jews live, you have at least 3 synagogues, and that's also true for opinions. So they don't necessarily all agree, but they can say that in most countries in question, if we talk about the, how did you say, populist parties, in most countries in question, Hungary and Austria, for example, Poland on a different level, there's a general consensus in the Jewish community, and what they tell me is that many of them are afraid. They're concerned that Israel will legitimize anti-Semitic voices in exchange for the support Netanyahu is seeking within the EU for his policies. And I think the debate is not whether the Freedom Parties past and present and Orban's statements on Miklos Horthy, for example, or the Polish Holocaust law are problematic, to say the least. I think the debate is on whether Israel should be on the front line of fighting them on behalf of the Jewish people, or that Israel's need for support in its fight against the Palestinians in the international arena is more important and permits some level of, I would say, sometimes overlooking. And this is also, like almost everything these days, became into a contentious, controversial issue between liberals and conservatives. So either you support the cause against a Palestinian state so deeply that you're willing to overlook those voices in the diaspora complaining, saying that they're afraid about the effect on anti-Semitism, and align with the extreme right on the grounds of mutual fight, for example, against immigration. Or you support the two-state solution and you have a broadly liberal point of view, and you condemn any rapprochement with those who manifest racism, not only towards Muslims, but also Jews. I think the main problem is that this is a very black and white debate. Israel's interests are kind of put versus the Jewish world. So that turns anti-Semitism for the first time into a partisan issue within the Jewish community itself. And it's a very dangerous trend, in my opinion. Why would we put Israel's interests in opposition to the Jewish world's? How can we ignore their cry in exchange to a vote in the EU? Are we even allowed to make that decision, morally or historically? So we didn't talk about the question of anti-Semitism versus the question of anti-Zionism, but of course I think it's not disconnected. Maybe a little bit Professor Bauer touched it. But I want to quote Professor Yehuda Elkanah, a Holocaust survivor and a researcher, who wrote this. Two people emerged from Auschwitz, a minority that claims this will never happen again to anyone, and a frightened majority that claims this will never happen to us again, the Jews. So, or in other words, it's the universal lesson versus the private, or maybe even Zionist lesson. And I think, unfortunately, this is not a question of minority versus majority anymore. I think in Israel, probably we see that it kind of switched. And I think there's much more support for the private lesson than the universal one. Even we hear a lot of opposition against the universal lesson. So now, ironically, Israel is on the anti-liberal side of this history. And I think this is very confusing for our European allies sometimes. And those, we find ourselves side by side and forming alliances with Orban, Strache, Morawiecki, Salvini, now Bolsonaro, Duterte, etc. And if we're talking about, I don't make policy, I just cover it. But I think that liberals should not let the extreme right own the anti-Semitism issue. They should raise their voices and align with their counterparts, just like the right does. So whether it's in parliaments, academia, or civil society, and especially between Israelis and the diaspora, because this is the only way to make this a bipartisan issue and bring back anti-Semitism to all arenas of discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all speakers. We now turn to a more part of the debate, the questions and answers. And I would like to go back to my first speaker, Professor Bauer. And I would like to ask you concerning the historical truth. We are a little bit in problem with the historical truth in recent years, in Israel and also in Europe. And I would like to ask you, and from this perspective of the historian, how can Israel, and what should be done in Israel in order to correct historical narratives today? Because we have to deal with new historical narratives in Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in Germany, in Austria. There are becoming more and more obvious and more present in the mainstream discourse, political and social discourse. History is being revisionized or reviewed. What can Israel do? What steps should Israel take in order to tackle this problem, in your view?
Well, the obvious answer is not much and not alone. But I think you need to realize what we are dealing with. In Poland, for instance, the Polish government invented a past that never was. In other words, it created an artificial image made up of elements of truth, half-truths, yeah? That were changed around in order to create a completely illusionary picture. Their action was not directed against Jews, but against the conservative, liberal opposition to the present government. An opposition that has conquered in elections, recent elections, the municipalities of Warsaw and Krakow and Gdansk, for instance, yeah? And a large number, very large number actually, there are 28 people, are liberal Polish historians who continue the tradition of Polish liberalism, which existed. Yeah? It was a minority movement, but it existed. And they are the ones who have found out what happened to the Jews in Poland in areas where they escaped the German actions and tried to hide amongst the Poles. And they discovered that between 150,000 and 200,000 Jews were murdered by Poles or handed over to the Polish collaborationist police that collaborated with the Germans and handed it over to the Germans or directly to the Germans. 150 to 200,000 people. Now, of course, they deny that. And they deny that by actions which are provocative. And really, you know, the government is anti-communist, but this is a Bolshevik anti-communism. They use Bolshevik methods to eliminate the opposition, try to eliminate the opposition. Fortunately, Poland is still a democratic country, more or less. Huh? Now, my problem is not only that. My problem is that my government agreed with that and signed on it. Something which is absolutely unacceptable. And Yad Vashem made a very clear statement about that. But it's not only there. Now, when you say in other countries, you have opposition groups in Western Europe, Central Europe, you have things like that in the United States too. Huh? But a government standing behind these things, you have only in a number of countries, Poland, Ukraine, and so on. Now, this is connected with hate speech. Now, they don't do hate speech themselves. They advance it, they make it possible. And hate speech does not only concentrate on Jews. Antisemitism is a central issue in hate speech, yes. But hate speech includes a wider spectrum. And if you want to deal with this wider spectrum, you have to deal with major companies, media companies, Zuckerberg, and Facebook, and Instagram, and WhatsApp, which are controlled by Zuckerberg. Yeah? And you mentioned this, the question of how to deal with that without attacking free speech. Yeah? You see, this hate speech is fantastic. Anti-Semitism is all over the place in that hate speech. Yeah? Sure. May I quote just one little piece? In America, in English, because most Americans don't speak Arabic. Huh? The Imam in Philadelphia, Abdul Hussein Abdul Khattab, says 3 weeks ago, February 15, the Jews are the vilest people in terms of their moral values, their nature and their violation of agreements. But when they live near Arabs, they adopted some of their moral values and customs. Remember how Menachem Begin, that Polish crook, would stand next to a pregnant woman and would make bets whether it is a boy or a girl. Then he would slit her belly open while she was still alive to see whether it is a boy or a girl. This happened 3 weeks ago in Philadelphia. Open society, right? And this happens everywhere. Now, you have, again, you have to put this in this context. So, when you ask me, what can we do about it? The answer is, obviously, we are limited. But we can do something with allies. And with the allies, we can do something which was mentioned here several times. Major efforts at education. Yeah? Major efforts. Now, IRA, I'm the active honorary chairman of IRA, yeah? And we do a lot of work there. And Dina was the academic advisor to IRA. And there are others. And we are not just Israelis. Jews actually in Ira are a small minority. Yeah? We have allies. Believe it or not, the official stand of the Vatican today is anti-Semitic. Our closest allies in the Catholic Church are the Jesuits. Yeah? 100 years ago, if you had said that, they would have sent you to a lunatic asylum straight away. Yeah? But those are our allies, and they are very effective. Yeah? And so are others. We need those allies. Jews are a tiny minority. They cannot fight anti-Semitism alone. And all these great declarations, we shall fight anti-Semitism, pure nonsense. We need allies. For their own good. Because anti-Semitism is a cancer that eats the body politic of all societies that have it. History has shown, you ask me as a historian, history has shown that wherever you have a spread in modern times, wherever you have spread of anti-Semitism, the society is sick and dies. One of the main reasons for the outbreak of World War II, not just what concerns the Holocaust, yeah? Outbreak of World War II was anti-Semitism. There's a document about that, a clear document. You ask me as a historian. August 1936, our friend Adolf Hitler, yeah, writes a private, so it's not propaganda, a private statement to Hermann Göring, number 2, in which he explains to him why Germany has to fight a war in another 4 years' time. And you, Göring, have to prepare Germany for it, because if you don't do that, Jewish Bolshevism will conquer the world in favor of the Jewish international conspiracy. World War II broke out, in part at least, because of anti-Semitism, and that cost 5.6 to 5.7 million Jewish lives in the Holocaust, and 29 million non-Jews in Europe alone, who died partly and largely because of anti-Semitism. Isn't that a good enough reason to fight it?
Thank you, Professor Bauer. Turning to our allies, Ambassador, can I ask you, you know, going back to the relations between certain political parties in Israel and political parties in Europe, right-wing, populist, what effect does it have on the EU position? How does the EU, or Germany in this case, the leader of the EU, look at these flourishing relations between some of the people in Israel, parties in Israel, and Europe, populist, and also, in parts, also anti-Semitic parties? How does the EU look at this from your standpoint?
Well, a major interest of Germany is the unity of the European Union. So what we are interested in is to speak with a common voice that we don't yet have, because we don't have a common foreign politics, but to have common positions with regard to different developments in the world. So it is, I mean, we are 28, as we have said before, we are 28 very different countries, and we try to formulate compromises, to develop, to forge also common positions with regard to foreign politics. So what we don't like actually is any kind of forces that try to undermine, you know, this the unity of the European Union. And what we also, this is what I already said, is that we think that 70 years after the end of the Second World War and the Shoah, values, we can still afford to have values apart from political interests. And human rights and equality of all men, and our legal orders the freedoms we grant to our citizens is something that we feel is very important. And so this is basically the main kind of pillars of our politics. This is the unity of the union, and that is that, not to give up for no price whatsoever this the fight for those values on which we created the European Union. Our intention is, our conviction is that without those values we can't create just international orders, and we feel that this kind of fair and just order is the basis for stability. So this is what basically characterizes our attitude towards these movements.
Thank you very much. Dr. Radian-Gordon, I would like to maybe ask you the same question with a bit of addition. There are flourishing relations between populist parties in Israel and in Europe, with Eurosceptic parties in Europe. This is, of course, this does not have a positive effect on the EU. We do not look at our best in the EU. What does, from your standpoint, what can the Israeli Foreign Ministry do under these circumstances? When you go to Europe, what kind of answers do you give them? What kind of questions are you asked from them?
Perhaps I should say how we view the different populist parties from, or what criteria do we have when we examine them. So I think that anti-Semitic stance, Nazi or neo-Nazi roots, attitudes, formations, beliefs, the people that are in those parties and that have a background of hate speech, of anti-Semitism, of participating in different neo-Nazi formations. So these are very clear criteria, and we take the time. We analyze how these parties evolve, if at all. Do they evolve? Do they still have the same people, the same formations, the same beliefs, the same set of values? It's very easy to say we have changed, but have you really changed? So I think this is something that we are very sensitive to, and this is the added value of a ministry, because if you have people, diplomats, wherever in Europe, and they are able to see, I would give the example of Le Pen's party in France. So we know what the attitudes are, we know who the people are. People that, as a diplomat, when you live in a place, you can feel, hopefully, the undertones. So it's very important to understand the undertones in the different countries.
What are the undertones?
Well, you know that there are some codes, if it's a visual code, for example, or some code words, or others. Depends on the party, depends on the country. You need to know those, the subtle details, and this is how we can form an opinion on the different parties. Of course, we recommend a policy. It is either accepted or not, but I think that in this case, it is something that has been accepted by all Israeli governments. Of course, things are not simple. It's a very complex reality, and you need to look for allies. And you know that, again, coming back to the case of Poland, for example, you know that you have a political ally there, but the government has, has made some policies that are revisionist in essence. So I think that we witnessed a long period of political crisis between Israel and Poland. Of course, Professor Bauer is of the opinion that we shouldn't have signed the agreement that we signed with Poland. But nevertheless, I think that we were very firm on not having the criminalization of people that would speak about the Holocaust and the actions of Poles during the Holocaust and so on. So in politics, you compromise sometimes, but I do not think that it was a bad compromise in this case. Again, in a very complex situation, you have to move very carefully. But I must stress once again that we are very careful and very analytical about what is happening. I know that we are not the only ones. I know that there are many others in Europe that are doing the same. And I think I would like to take the opportunity also to comment on what France is doing right now, President Macron and his government, and to say, for example, that we have touched very briefly on the issue of anti-Zionism and the relations to anti-Semitism. So I think that in the case of France, President,
I would like to give you this opportunity to
okay,
give you the
so
opportunity to talk about it in your summary.
Okay, so
but we will,
stop
if
here.
you would like to
Okay.
address the subject of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, you will be able to do this in the summary. I know that the ambassador you wanted to react. Maybe just in short, I would like to ask also Ms. Landau another question, just in short.
Very, very brief. Maybe more on a personal note. I also see with some concern the rise of those parties in Eastern and Central European countries. But I just wanted to support Rodica in her effort to explain us how complex and complicated it is and how difficult it is to have white-black solutions. I just wanted to say something from a different side that Rodica said, that it is of central importance for the European Union to have the Central and Eastern European countries after the fall of the wall be included. Europe without them wouldn't be Europe. And the other thing Rodica said is you can't imagine how long and difficult the way was these countries had to take before entering the European Union. So for 20 or more years, we, the Western countries of the European Union, told our Eastern and Central European newcomers how to read the world and how they should be. So we are concerned, that is true, but it is a very complex and complicated situation for them, and we need to have maybe patience, but we need also to make them know how central they are for all of us. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Landau, I would like to I would like to ask you, maybe be a little bit the devil's advocate here, and maybe really to represent the other side, and I would like to know what you think about that. There are some notions, and there are not few, within the Israeli society, in the media and in the politics and in the academia as well, voices that say that it's actually the best thing that ever happened to us, to the state of Israel, to have such supporters from Europe, coming from Hungary or from Poland or from the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Visegrad countries, that decide, not all of them, but definitely on the way of moving their embassies to Jerusalem, to the capital of Israel. This is definitely a statement that says a lot, and it's the best, it's Israel's best dream. How come are we against it? So yeah, maybe there can be a little bit of a problem with anti-Semitism, but it's not that much, or we can overlook that. The most important thing is to take care of Israel's interests, strategic interests, political interests. They in Europe, they don't understand what we have to go through here in the Middle East situation and the wars that we constantly have to deal with. So these are notions in Israel that they exist here. What is your view about that? How is it, and I know some journalists are writing about this as well, what do you think about this discourse in Israel? How does it affect our policy in the end?
First of all, you said there's some anti-Semitism, but maybe it's not. I mean, we're doing a whole conference about how it is important. You know,
Devil's advocate, not
yes.
my political views.
I'm sitting here between two diplomats, and I really admire the way they made everything sound so, you know, peaceful, not problematic. Everything is, of course, complex, so we make compromises and so on. But in a very diplomatic, academic setting, we're talking about populism, which is the exact opposite, right? So we're talking, you know, here very nicely about all those issues, while those leaders are making, and I think our leaders as well, are making very undiplomatic statements. You don't have to comment. I'm just, you know, I'm being the devil's advocate. So I think when the German ambassador speaks about how important unity in the EU is to them, how they would like to see Israel as an ally in that goal, how it's I don't remember the exact word, but the difficulty of voices undermining that unity, and the fact that we still can have values, not only politics, like human rights and freedoms and so on. Basically, she's saying everything that Netanyahu is doing. I mean, Netanyahu is undermining UN unity. I don't have the exact quote here, but I was in the Baltic summit when Netanyahu said very clearly that his diplomatic goal, his mission, is to undermine the EU unity. So, and he's not saying it diplomatically and talking about the complexity. He says he wants to undermine the European unity because of Israeli issues, such as the Palestinian issue and Iran also, and so on. So I just want to remind us that when we talk about all the complexities and so on, we also have, we should also remind ourselves what kind of voices we are dealing with. And also, when we talk about EU diplomacy, I always hear the words shared values, right? Because this is the post-World War II lessons that I've touched on earlier when we talk about those liberal values after the Shoah that founded all these multilateral forums. Do we share those values? I mean, I'm not sure I'm the one who should answer it, but, you know, ask yourselves, does Israel, or should I say Netanyahu's government, because, you know, it's not everyone in Israel, do we share the same values as Germany and France when we talk about those liberal shared values? And also, I think when the foreign ministry, it was very interesting to hear how the foreign ministry observes those parties and looks at the process that they're doing. Is it really improving? Is it not? How to assess the relations. Again, it's only about anti-Semitism, only about that unique racism towards Jews, not other issues within those populist parties and manifestations of other forms of racism. So again, we're talking about only our the specific private Jewish lesson of the Holocaust, and not those shared universal values that maybe when France and Germany look at those parties, they will also look at all forms of racism, not only anti-Semitism, when examining the relations with those parties. Regarding
last
the
sentence? And then
sorry, so just regarding the, you said you were talking about the embassies, and actually it's, you know, trying to also answer your question, that some voices in Israel claim that it's very good for us because, for example, the embassies are one point. I just want to say that most members of the EU didn't actually move their embassy. So just, you know, to make that fact clear.
Thank you. Since we are approaching the end of this very interesting roundtable, I'd like to give you the opportunity to really answer in short, since we really have a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes each, to the following questions, and with this I will also close. Professor Bauer, you said an important sentence in your opening speech. You said, Israel needs the EU, we need Europe, and Europe needs us. And I would like to ask each of you to think on his own or her own, what does it mean for you that Germany needs Israel, in which aspect, in which way Israel needs Germany, or the EU in general, from your specific standpoints, the diplomatic, the journalist, the historian?
Did you say 2 minutes or 20 minutes?
3.
All 3 hours.
And then we will finish.
I think you cannot deal with European politics or Mideastern politics or any politics today, certainly not in Israel, without dealing with the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a civilization changing, this is a German expression, Zivilisationsbruch, which was coined by Dan Dehner in Leipzig. It's a civilization-changing series of events, which we call the Holocaust inaccurately, but that doesn't matter. What Europe needs Israel for is something almost intangible. In other words, it's the fact that the survivors and the relatives of the survivors and the people who have no relationship to the survivors, created for this people that was to be destroyed a presence, a political presence. It has to be defended. Because if it's not defended, Europe will suffer, because the memory of the Holocaust, I once said, and people attacked me for it, if the Jews forget the Holocaust, the others will remind them of it. It's the most extreme case of a general human illness. The human illness is genocide. The extreme form was the Holocaust. And this could happen again to Jews, to others, anywhere in the world. Therefore, the importance of Israel to the European Union, to Europeans, is not just economic and social and political interests, which exist, which are perfectly legitimate, but something much more than, much deeper than that. And I think that that is the major issue.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
What could I possibly add after that? I mean, this is the answer in particular for the German need of Israel. Maybe I could just remind also to a statement that the German Chancellor made 2008 in a speech at the Knesset when she spoke about this relationship, and she said that the commitment for the security and the existence of the State of Israel is part of the German raison d'être. It's part of the German identity. So, I mean, I think this is not anything that is with regard to any other country in the world.
Thank you. Rodica, please.
I will build on Susanna's last word. I think, first of all, I think that both Europe and Israel feel that we belong to the same family. And I work very hard for it to continue and be that way, and I'm sure that all my European colleagues here are doing the same. I think we do belong to the same family, and as sister nations, in a way, that share a very, very long history, a good one and a bad one, we need to be committed to each other. And for us, it is very important that Europe indeed is committed to our national security and to our well-being, and fighting anti-Zionism is part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Noah, please.
First of all, I think if those very impressive two women here would have, be the leaders of this issue, this would probably look, totally different. But unfortunately, we do need to realize that when we speak so nicely about populism, populism is doing something totally different outside of this room. So we should also speak very clearly about what is happening. And I think Israel there's a real dilemma now in Israel, and it's a real crossroad. Do we want to still talk about anti-Semitism as a unique form of racism that we only want to address, or do we really share those values, those liberal values that are in a crisis, and we want to address this issue as a whole? As I think Professor Bauer said earlier, and I really identified with him, it's a wider issue. It's a global issue. And I think Israel should be a part of that global issue, not only focus on our specific issue.
I should have added that the Holocaust came from Germany, obviously, but it was an all-European project. Nobody comes clean. Nobody comes clean, including us.
I want to thank each and every one of you for a very, very interesting and important roundtable. Thank you very, very much. And I hope this resonates also beyond the halls of the Institute for National Security Studies. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming tonight. And thank you very much, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the association led by Professor Alberto.